Welcome to All Ages Storytime. This summer is part of Tales and Tales for Read, Do, Explore. We're going to be doing stories that Beatrix Potter wrote. She was an English author and illustrator and conservationist. Her tales about animals living in a small English town in the mountains have been bestsellers for over a century. She grew up in the city of London, but her parents and extended family would rent a home in the country over the summers. Beatrix and her brother Bertram spent as much time outdoors as they could. They explored everything. Bertram went on to become an artist and paint outdoor scenes. Beatrix sent letters to her friends' children, and she drew pictures and added stories to those letters. Her friends said she should publish those as children's books. So she did. Peter Rabbit was a bestseller, and so were the stuffed animals and other toys based on him. Beatrix grew and was able to buy a small farm with profits from her book sales. She asked another local farmer to teach her the best way to run the farm, and she studied hard to learn about what kind of sheep and other animals would do best in the hilly land in her area. Beatrix became a very successful farmer. She wanted to keep the land available for people to farm and not have it turned into housing tracts. She met her husband, a local lawyer, who shared her interest, and together they worked with many others to create a way for the land to remain farmed and profitable, not sold at a quick profit for houses. Among Beatrix's other drawings are some she made of mushrooms. She was an expert on mushrooms in the Lake region of England. Her drawings are still used in mushroom identification books because they are so detailed. She did scientific experiments to learn about mushrooms. Beatrix was a woman of many skills and talents. So settle in for tales of rabbits named Peter, ducks named Jemima, and others in a furry cast of characters. Once upon a time, there were 4 little rabbits, and their names were Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter. They lived with their mother in a sandbank under the root of a very big fir tree. "Now, my dear," said old Mrs. Rabbit one morning, "you may go into the fields, you may go down the lane, but don't go to Mr. McGregor's garden. Your father had an accident there, and he ended up in a pie made by Mrs. McGregor. Now, run along and don't get into mischief. I am going out." Then old Mrs. Rabbit took a basket and her umbrella and went through the wood to the baker's. She bought a loaf of brown bread and 5 currant buns. Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail, who were good little bunnies, went down the lane to gather blackberries. But Peter, who was very naughty, ran straight away to Mr. McGregor's garden and squeezed under the gate. First, he ate some lettuce, then some French beans, and then he ate some radishes. Then, feeling rather sick, he went to look for some parsley. But round the end of the cucumber frame, who should he be but Mr. McGregor? Mr. McGregor was on his hands and knees planting out young cabbages. But he jumped up and ran after Peter, waving a fork, saying, "Stop, thief!" Peter was most dreadfully frightened, and he rushed all over the garden, for he had forgotten the way back to the gate. He lost one of his shoes in the cabbages. He lost his other shoe in the potatoes. And after losing them, he ran on 4 legs, and he went faster than I think he might have got away altogether if he had not unfortunately gotten caught in the gooseberry net. And he got caught by the large buttons on his jacket. It was a blue jacket with brass buttons, quite new. Peter gave himself up for lost and shed big tears. But his sobs were overheard by some friendly sparrows, who flew to him in great excitement and implored him to exert himself. Mr. McGregor came up with a sieve, which he intended to pop on top of Peter, but Peter wriggled out just in time, leaving his jacket behind him. He rushed into the tool shed and jumped into a can. It would have been a beautiful thing to hide in if it had not had so much water. Mr. McGregor was quite sure that Peter was somewhere in the tool shed. perhaps hidden underneath a flower pot. So he began to turn them over carefully, looking under each. Presently, Peter had to sneeze. Ka-choo! Mr. McGregor was after him in no time. As he tried to put his foot down upon Peter, he jumped out the window, upsetting 3 plants. The window was too small for Mr. McGregor, but not too small for Peter. And Mr. McGregor was tiring of running after Peter. He went back to his work. Peter sat down to rest because he was out of breath. He was trembling in fright, and he had not the least idea of which way to go. And also, he was very damp from sitting in that can of water. After a time, he began to wander about, going lippity, lippity, not very fast, and looking all around. He found a door in the wall, but it was locked and there was no room for a fat little rabbit to squeeze underneath it. An old mouse was running in and out over the stone doorstep, carrying peas and beans to her family in the woods. Peter asked her the way to the gate, but she had such a large pea in her mouth, she couldn't answer. She only shook her head at him. Peter began to cry. Then he tried to find his way straight across the garden, but he became more and more puzzled. Presently, he came to the pond where Mr. McGregor filled his watering cans, and a white cat was staring at some goldfish in the pond. She sat very, very still, but every now and then the tip of her tail would twitch. Peter thought it best to go away without speaking to her. He had heard about cats from his little cousin Benjamin Bunny. He went back towards the tool shed, but suddenly, quite close to him, he heard the noise of the hoe. Scritch! Scratch, scratch, scritch! Peter scuttered under the bushes. But presently, as nothing happened, he came out and climbed up on a wheelbarrow and peeped over the top. And the first thing he saw was Mr. McGregor hoeing his onions. His back was towards Peter. But on the other side of him was the gate. Peter got down very quietly off the wheelbarrow and started running as fast as he could go along the straight walk behind some black currant bushes. Mr. McGregor caught sight of him out of the corner of his eye, but Peter didn't care. He slipped under the gate and was safe at last in the woods outside the garden. Mr. McGregor hung up the little jacket and the shoes as a scarecrow to frighten away blackbirds. Peter never stopped running or looked behind him until he got home to the big fir tree. And he was so tired that he flopped down on the nice soft sand on the floor of the rabbit hole and shut his eyes. His mother was busy cooking. She wondered what he had done with his clothes. It was the second little jacket and pair of shoes that Peter had lost in the last 2 weeks. I am sorry to say that Peter was not very well that evening. His mother put him to bed and made him some chamomile tea. And she gave a dose of it to Peter. 1 tablespoon to be taken at bedtime, she said. But Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail, they had bread and milk and blackberries for supper. And that is the end of the story of Peter Rabbit. See you next week for All Ages Storytime.